Hi, I'm Stephen Tang. I hope you'll come listen to this episode where we talk about crisis leadership in the next normal, using the pandemic as an example. So, come hear me talk about strategy, about trust, about wholehearted leadership, and leading whole people wholeheartedly. I guarantee you'll get something out of it.
And hello, fabulous person. Beate Gillette here. I am the host of the Business Growth Architect Show, and I want to welcome you to today's episode where we discuss how to navigate strategy and spirituality to achieve time and financial freedom. Truly successful people have learned how to master both a clear intention and a strategy to execute that in a spiritual practice that will help them to stay in alignment and on purpose. Please enjoy the show and listen to what our guest today has to say about this very topic. And hello, welcome back. This is your host, Beate Gillette, and we are in an episode with Stephen Tang. And Stephen is someone I am so excited to have on the show because he is a CEO. He is on boards. He has taken a company during a COVID crisis and done something unbelievable that I can't wait to share with you today. And he talks a lot about what is the next normal, not the new normal, the next normal, and how to manage really crisis and leadership and crisis. So, Stephen, I'm excited you're here. Thank you so much for coming to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my pleasure. Great to be here.
So your resume is pretty extensive. So for somebody who does not know who you are or hasn't heard about you, how would we introduce them to you? Like, what are the highlights?
I am the son of Chinese immigrants. My parents came to America after the Second World War and the Civil War in China, for which the communists drove out the democracy-loving people elsewhere. So my parents made their way here to the U.S. So I'm a first-generation American. In some respects, I hold very near and dear my immigrant heritage. And in many more respects, I'm an all-American kid that was raised that way. So I have a lot of degrees, which we don't have to get into, but suffice it to say, when I graduated high school, I was only halfway through my education. I did 12 more years of post-secondary education. I have degrees in chemistry, chemical engineering, and in business. I'm a husband, a father, a grandfather, and a son. All those things professionally. I've been delighted and honored to be the chairman or CEO of organizations for combined over 30 years. So I have a view of leadership and governance that comes from slugging it all out, making mistakes, recovering, and regrouping and pivoting and all those things. So I think that's the best way to describe me in a brief opening statement.
Well, and you're being very humble as I expected you to be, but I want to dive into sort of one of the highlights that you probably I don't know if it's the right way to say most famous for, but widely recognized for, and that was the role that you had during COVID and working for a company that then was responsible for bringing the self-test to the market. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what the role was and what you actually did so people really understand the magnitude of your leadership capacity?
Well, the company is OraSure Technologies, which was founded back in the 1980s, became a public company in 2000. It's located in a little town called Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour north of Philadelphia. Bethlehem is best known for its steel, Bethlehem Steel, which found its way into the Golden Gate Bridge and many buildings around the world. They're not known for life sciences, biotechnology, and that's the kind of company that OraSure is. So it comes by its roots humbly. It was a spin out of Lehigh University, where I'm a graduate alumni. And the company focused for many years, its first 20 years of being a public company, on having convenient tests for epidemics like HIV, hepatitis C, Ebola. So we were at the front lines of testing people to get them into treatment and care as quickly as possible. So we had those credentials coming into the pandemic. But as we all know, the pandemic was above and beyond anything we could have possibly imagined. I wrote about it in my blog this morning. It's the difference between understanding linear growth and geometric growth. So by the time that we fully understood the magnitude of the challenge with COVID-19, the disease was well beyond us. And that's why 7 million people lost their lives to this horrible disease. So a company like OraSure had some credibility in the industry with the FDA, with healthcare providers in developing easy-to-use tests. So what we did during the pandemic was successfully launch a product called IntelliSwab, which Oprah Winfrey's company called the easiest test to use of its kind. I think it didn't hurt that the color purple was the
Her favorite color, yes.
yes, and that was the color on our box. But at any rate, the company expanded its capabilities, the manufacturing capability by a factor of 6, increased its revenues by a factor of 4, and this is all during the pandemic, when everybody was largely working remote, except for people in laboratories and manufacturing. And to be able to harness the ingenuity of the company, rapidly scale it up beyond anything any of us had ever accomplished at OraSure before, to me was an extraordinary accomplishment for so many people. And it's equally consequential because this test helped save lives because we got it to the market. Obviously, COVID is a disease where you can spread it when you don't have symptoms. That makes it much more dangerous and deadly. And so to have tests that were convenient to use and apply our know-how and expertise into this profound opportunity was the story I wrote in my book, A Test for Our Time. So leadership had something to do with it, but I think it had a lot to do with the grittiness, the gumption, the perseverance, the resilience of so many people at OraSure Technologies. And I'm eternally grateful for them and was delighted to be their leader during that time.
One thing that really struck me as I was taking a look at the book and going into some of the story, your story isn't exactly the prince story. You didn't wake up a prince and people were handing you things until one day you were crowned the king.
Hardly.
So, your story is one where you had many obstacles and challenges, and oftentimes, as the next opportunity came, it wasn't exactly like the opportunity was presented to you on a silver platter, but it had a couple of sharp hooks in it. You talk about crisis leadership a lot. So, how would we define crisis leadership in your world?
Well, crisis leadership, I think, has to do with dealing with circumstances that are not your choosing. So you're just dealt a very bad hand and you try to make the best of it. And you do so by mustering the persuasiveness to convince a lot of people who have to do their best work to get it done to do it because it made sense for them intellectually, spiritually, and it in many ways touched their heart. So in this case, for our IntelliSwab COVID-19 test, you didn't have to convince anybody who was at home under lockdown conditions that they needed to get out of that situation. And so it was very clear to all of us at OraSure and elsewhere that if we could develop tests like that, then we'd be helping ourselves too. So it was almost a perfect alignment of individual interest and the greater good to overcome it. And so that's what I mean by crisis leadership. It's mounting a tremendous set of obstacles by getting people to do things together they never dreamed they could do before the crisis.
I love this a lot because there's so much simplicity in it. I think that, and during COVID, in the very early stage before we had a vaccine, I spoke to Johnson and Johnson, to the team that was working on the vaccine. And the message that I had received from the CTO for my conversation was, tell them they have everything that they need and we believe in them.
I couldn't say it better. I mean, I think first and foremost, during the pandemic, we just couldn't treat people like they were 9 to 5, serfs or subjects, serving the king here, right? We had to recognize that they were under significant duress, maybe even under life-threatening conditions. And so the role of a leader, a business leader, company leader, became quite different. And so this construct of Maslow's hierarchy of needs really came into play. You had to really assure people that they're, number one, going to be safe, and that you are not going to ask them to do anything to compromise their health and safety and wellness for themselves, their families, their loved ones. And then beyond that, if you could get them to that point, you need to make sure that they understood that you knew what they needed to get the job done. And you had to trust them. And so there was a lot of foundational work we did at OraSure to ensure people that we trusted them, that that we were trustworthy. And I think it's that two-way street of building trust to get things done, which was foundational. And I'm not assuming we had a monopoly on that philosophy. Obviously, the folks at J&J believe the same thing. But a lot of companies, I think, struggled with convincing folks that there was trust flowing in both directions.
So I want to shift now to the two things that really interest me, the strategy and spirituality. So as you're going into this, there's a lot at stake. So you had to have a strategy of some sort. Were you clear what the strategy was, or was it unfolding? And I don't know where the trust formula fits in here. So you tell me when the cue is right to bring that up. I envision you, from what I have learned about you, that you were going to build the people and the people's trust in you first before you ask them for anything. Am I correct on that?
That's correct. And let's take us back to March 2020. March 13th happened to be my older daughter's birthday. So that's the day that we all went into lockdown. And none of us knew how long it would last. Some people thought it'd be a few weeks. We'd just go back to normal, right? Well, it's been 4 years. We haven't been back to normal, right? So first and foremost, I had to convince them that I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know how long this was going to last. I didn't know how people were getting infected. And I would consistently err on the side of their safety and wellness. Okay, so that was foundational. During that time, my crack staff of R&D scientists convinced me that they could actually do this technically. They could make a convenient, easy to use COVID test. And then the process began of convincing the board of directors to make the massive investments it was going to take to get us there. So you mentioned strategy. The strategy to me is very simple. It's what's the opportunity and are you capable of addressing it? All right. Now, as I said before, OraSure had experience in other infectious diseases like HIV and Ebola and hepatitis C. So we had capability. But this opportunity was orders of magnitude bigger than we could ever have imagined. And I'll give you an example of that. So in the first 20 years that OraSure had been a public company, the number of tests we had sold over those 20 years was 80 million tests. We had proposed to the board that we were going to increase the capacity of the company to produce 80 million tests a year, every single year. To avoid the shock value of that, and maybe even the hilarity of trying to do so, we had to be very buttoned down. We had to not have just the CEO say, I believe in this. We had to cascade that down into the organization, down to the line worker, the manufacturing technician, the maintenance technician. They all had to say, yes, we can do this, and we want to do this. There was really no wiggle room because the capability we had was so far less than the opportunity size. So that's the strategy piece. Okay. Now, one of the things that I've reflected on since the beginning of the pandemic is there's this notion, which I first heard emphatically from one of my sales executives who like to say, hope is not a strategy. Right. And that is the kind of thing you want to hear from your sales executive, because you don't want them to be making up the number, particularly if you're a public company. You've got to reconcile that every quarter, right?
There are certain parameters that the SEC wants to see, and I'm pretty sure hope is not part of it.
That's correct. It doesn't find its way into risk factors. It's hard to eloquently explain to a SEC lawyer.
We were hoping for the best.
Right. That one doesn't fly very well. But I will say this: if you are trying to get people to perform at optimal capability, hope does matter. Okay, hope, I think, converts fear into courage, if you will. And so, what's the basis of doing so? They have to have faith that they can actually do it. Well, if they have faith and they have hope, even though they can't see it and feel it right now, they know they can get there. And that leads to the third pillar, which is trust. In the book, I write of the trust formula that I've abided by most of my career, which is trust is equal to credibility times intimacy, all divided by risk. So for those that don't like math, let me break it down a little differently. Okay.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Because at first, when you look at it, you go, okay, take us through this step by step.
Sure. So under normal everyday interactions between a supervisor and an employee, trust doesn't have to be very high because the day can be planned out day to day. You get into a rhythm where you know what to expect. But in a crisis, all right, where the risk is very high, okay, if risk is very high, and what I just described, and increasing our manufacturing capacity from 80 million tests over 20 years to 80 million tests a year, right?
Yeah.
That's high risk. No, there's just no doubt about that. So that means that you have to breed trust at a much higher level than you've ever had it before. And so, how do you do that? Well, first, it's credibility. Credibility is the basic human interaction, which is you do what you say you're going to do, and I do what I say I was going to do. So if I say I'm going to support you, and I support you, then you must do what you said you were going to do. So that's the foundations of accountability. And in this case, at OraSure was accountability based on empowerment. In other words, I trust you to get this done. And I'm empowering you to make decisions to create your world to get this done. So that's credibility. The other piece, which is equally important, which I think is often ignored, is intimacy, which means I trust you because I know you have my back. In other words, I know that you have my well-being, my best interest in mind when you're making decisions. I know you won't compromise me. I know that you won't send me to the office and then send me back home with the specter of getting my family ill. I know that's not going to happen. Okay. And it also means on the flip side that I trust your leadership. I trust your vision and I believe in it. And that's where hope as a strategy is very, very important. So all those three elements to me came to life during the pandemic as we were striving to, not defeat COVID, because ultimately we didn't defeat COVID. We played it to a draw over 4 years, right? And so recognizing that that was the game we were in, I think, and being as transparent and honest with everybody every step of the way, even when we made mistakes, I think became very, very important. And if you think about it, the circumstances we did this in during the pandemic, it was unlike any other situation that anybody's ever dealt with. I mean, we used to say you can't trust somebody unless you look them in the eye, right? Well, I'm talking to you right now, Beate, and I'm not looking you in the eye. I'm looking at you. If I look at you in the eye, I'm looking at the camera, in
Yeah,
which
I
case
know.
I can't see you, which doesn't lead for a very connected
Engaging conversation.
conversation. Exactly right. So all the things that we thought were immutable truths before the pandemic, which is, oh, you really need to look somebody in the eye. You really need to be in the same room as everybody else. You really do need to see them and see their body language. That was not the way we did business during the pandemic. So this is, I think, something that we need to watch out for. And in the book, I think tried to describe an environment where we use the experience during the pandemic in hybrid work or remote work and better capitalize on them by doing it intentionally. Because certainly during the pandemic, we didn't do any of this intentionally. We did it because we had to do it. There was no choice. But now that we have a choice, it just confounds me how few employers or thought leaders have stepped up and say, yeah, this is the kind of person who will lead well in a crisis situation. And these are the skills for the employees that step up to the challenge as well. So I'm still waiting for that. And hopefully that'll happen soon.
To your point, I think that what we are seeing right now, what's happening in the economic environment, is that they seem to not be able to get fast enough back to the year 1864, right? So I think a lot of the stuff that we have made advances on when we were clear that diversity, equity, inclusion really played a part in coming together, finding something so extraordinary. And then the minute we believe the danger is over, we revert back to decades before that, behaviors that were way, 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 way before that, which just leads you to believe that we just don't learn as the human race. We are, I don't know if we're incapable of learning because it's not profitable enough, even though we know that the data says the opposite, that when people are engaged and that when we have team members that believe in the cause, that they will work harder and better and get more done. And I think we're seeing a huge backlash in amongst employees right now because they saw right through this. They say, you told us everything we wanted to hear and we believed you. And now it turns out this was an act. Now we don't believe you anymore. And therefore, look at what's happening. And it's absolutely miserable. So let's talk about the spiritual aspect of things right after this quick message. Have you ever wondered what the actual amount of your true earning potential is in this market? To find out what your talent is worth, take our quiz at whatsyourtalentworth.com. You will find out your actual earning potential amount by using our proprietary profit formula. Enjoy the quiz, and again, the URL is whatsyourtalentworth.com. Stephen, I mean, besides that, I could talk to you for hours about these things because I think you and I are very much aligned on sort of how we look at the role of a leader, especially in a crisis, that there has to be in your world a spiritual aspect. I've never heard anybody come up with a formula that included intimacy. That tells me one thing about you, that you look deeper than most people do. How do you manage the spiritual aspect of what you do? And as a CEO of a company that's in the sciences, I mean, isn't it the last thing that anybody expected you to be? How did you manage this?
Well, believe it or not, there are many scientists who are actually very spiritual people. So
There should be. It's the same laws, right?
precisely, I look at Dr. Francis Collins, who ran the NIH for many years, who's written books talking about his spirituality and how that fits his world as a scientist and a physician. So I don't view these things as
Good.
widely disparate from each other. We each have our own spiritual journey. And it's not my place to impose my beliefs on anybody. But I have lived through many things in my life. I've lived with childhood illnesses. I've lived through a divorce. I've lived, I'm a colon cancer survivor. Before I went to graduate school at Lehigh to get my PhD in chemical engineering, I considered the priesthood as a Roman Catholic. So I have embraced this journey and trying to find meaning in my own life and my own struggles. And before the pandemic happened. So I'm a believer that spirituality is extremely important. And we all have to believe we're here for a greater cause. It just can't be the life we have in our human body for how many years you're lucky to have your body with you. And I have always believed at some level, and more so today, that I'm actually a spiritual being having a human experience, not a human being having a spiritual experience. And so that helps me transcend a lot of things that go on that are distracting from human experience, not the least of which is dealing with the egos at the top level of management and boards. I mean, that happens, right? But we have to appeal to each other, I think, at a higher level. And that's to me what spirituality is. Now, the book's anthem, Lead Whole People Wholeheartedly, has spirituality in the center of that. So what does that mean? What does lead whole people mean? Well, it means exactly what happened in the pandemic for OraSure, which is recognizing that these are not people that are tasked to do work for you. These are whole people with real life challenges, some existential threats and some painful realities of being cooped up in the house with your spouse, both of you working on your laptops and your kids being tried to school remotely, and everybody in the same place 24/7. I mean, that's not an ideal circumstance for anybody. I think it's the closest any of us would have experienced either incarceration or wartime together in a bunker than we ever had before. So guess what? If you were trying to lead people to do the extraordinary, you own their entire lives, not just the portion that were working for you. Okay. So that's what the whole people part of it. The lead wholeheartedly piece is recognizing that we all have minds, bodies, and spirits that leaders need to explicitly recognize in themselves and others and nurture that. And so I think the key to success during the pandemic for OraSure in creating and scaling and manufacturing and marketing IntelliSwab was recognizing that that's what was going on. And that's the only way I believe we could harness the hearts and minds of everybody to pull in the same direction. And I think it's an extraordinarily powerful experience that is not over yet if we can be more intentional in how we treat people. And if you get into that sort of state of flow, then the issue is not that people aren't working hard enough. It's that they're working too hard and they might face burnout. In other words, they're so devoted and passionate about what they're doing that they have neglected other parts of their lives. And that's why relating to them as body, mind, and spirit makes so much sense, because that means you really honestly care about them and love them as people. I think that's where we're going with this.
I have a question for you on that. Do you believe that on the corporate side, I definitely see we just touched on that, an attempt to reverse it back to what it was before COVID, to be all business. On the other side of the employee, I see a very intense movement against that very thing. Do you feel that same thing? Are we getting further apart now? And is there a silver lining? Because you talk about the next normal. I have a nagging suspicion, using your language, the next normal is going to be that the corporate America is trying to get back to business, business, business. But the employee says, oh no, I want the body, mind, and spirit. What's the next normal on that? Do you see that discrepancy, or is it just me?
Well, I define the next normal in the following way, which is it will be a rolling set of crises that we have to deal with either individually or in combination. And some of these may come at waves. So an example would be because of the shift in the planet's climate, that means that species are going to come together that were never or have not been intended to live together and commune together with all their bacteria and viruses coming together, which makes it ripe for another pandemic. So the way we deal with climate change, the way we deal with pandemics are pieces of crises that are yet to happen. So the next normal means that essentially you need to be an enlightened leader and be an enlightened employee. It can't be one-sided. And so I think the companies that are driving the chasm between enlightened employees, and I do believe, Beate, that what happened during the pandemic was a reset in people's fundamental values and what they value out of life. And I don't think we're going back on that one, because I think people have lived through a very stressful 4 years period of time, and it's clear to me that they foundationally have changed. So I would look at the other way. Rather than saying that the chasm is what we should focus on, is I think we should focus on the accelerant to bring these enlightened employers and enlightened employees together. And to me, if companies would recognize that that's the opportunity in terms of leadership and people management, they would put so much distance between themselves and their competitors to attract the best talent and deploy that talent through hybrid work or remote work, whatever the case may be, and be able to hire the best people, regardless of where they live, to all come together and work together. So to me, that's the blueprint for the future. That's what the next normal will be about, is dealing with these crises, but also recognizing the people who are enlightened from a leadership perspective, enlightened from an employee perspective, and bringing them together.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that the part of the reason I am bringing spirituality into strategy, because I think it's important that we really put this out to the forefront and say there are no successful people that have a life that I consider worthy that don't have a spiritual practice, because money isn't everything. And we know money isn't everything, but then it's still so heavily promoted. But how good is all of this if you don't have your health? David Meltzer said on my show, he says, when you are healthy, you have many wishes. When you're not healthy, you only have one wish.
I absolutely believe that. And I think that if we get ourselves from a scarcity mindset of not having enough or having too little into one of abundance, where we share the spiritual good of the universe together, that to me foundationally is a much better starting place than we're all looking to eat the scraps off the table.
Yes, 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 yes. There's enough for all of us to go around. All right. It's been amazing to have you on the show. Now, your book. Tell us about your book, and where can our audience go get the book?
The book is A Test for Our Time. It's going to be Crisis Leadership in the Next Normal. It's available at most bookstores, online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
Including Target.
Including Target, including Walmart.
Yes.
And I would say this: A Test for Our Time is meant to have several meanings. The first is about IntelliSwab and how we developed this test for our time. But it's also the test for our time that we all lived through in surviving the pandemic, and some of us looking to thrive during the pandemic. And then it's also my personal challenge as both a leader and what came after leadership for me, at OraSure. So it has many dimensions to a test for our time. And I hope everybody found some meaning that resonates with them through it.
Wonderful. And for anybody who wants to reach out to you, perhaps for a speaking engagement or a board position of some sort, where would we send them?
My website is www.tang.ceo, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. We talked about a lot. We talked about the strategy. We talked about a real crisis and how to lead in a crisis, how to motivate people, and the spiritual aspect of things. And I loved that you said, "Well, of course, I'm spiritual because the laws of science and spirituality are indeed the same." So, thank you again for being on the show.
It's been my pleasure, Beate. Pleasure to be with you.
And that's it for us for today. Thank you so much for listening to or watching this episode. Please share this with one other person that might need a little bit of help in crisis leadership at this very moment. Thanks again and goodbye. So appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for listening to the entire episode. Please subscribe to the podcast, give us a 5-star review, a comment, and share this episode with one more person so that you can help us help more people. Thank you again. Until next time. Goodbye.